Siempre Cuba ha estado luchando por su libertad.
Murieron 100,000 personas. No pudo triunfar, pero cambió el país.
There is little question that Meyer Lansky had thoroughly corrupted Batista.
It's not a lie. They didn't promise anything. They promised a revolution. They did a revolution.
Эти ребята обязательно будут либо мучениками, либо национальными героями.
Fidel Castro.
He told Khrushchev, you should unleash the entire Soviet nuclear arsenals. Apocalypse.
Kuba lässt sich nicht in die Knie zwingen.
Today's Cuba is known as a tropical island paradise, and perhaps for its 1959 revolution. But Cuba's revolutionary history is far older. For almost 400 years, Cuba was a Spanish colony. Its road to independence was long and painful. In the end, it took an American intervention to free Cuba from Spanish colonial rule. And with this freedom, the Cubans thought their island would prosper. But why did Cuba's newfound wealth not benefit every Cuban? How did World War I create tremendous opportunities for Cuba? And why did it take a military dictator to really free Cuba? Throughout its history, the burden of colonialism has weighed heavy on the island. But the Cubans have never given up on their dream of freedom.
Cuba es un país que llega tardíamente a la independencia y es una independencia que se va a frustrar a lo largo de los años una y otra vez. De ahí que es un deseo que se va concentrando y concentrando.
For 400 years, Cuba was the key to Spain's colonial empire in the Americas. Even when all other colonies became independent, Cuba remained loyal to Spain. Its long battle for independence finally broke out in 1868. Spain sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to hold the island. In 1898, the United States intervened in the war. Spain was finally beaten and withdrew its troops. American soldiers were soon augmented by U.S. government officials. Their mission was to help transform the former colony into a state. The island's economy flourished due to American investments and the end of Spanish taxes and duties.
La ocupación militar fue un momento histórico en Cuba muy importante porque se encontraron sentimientos, ánimos, maneras de mirar lo que estaba sucediendo. O sea, la llegada y permanencia de los Estados Unidos.
Following the end of the war with Spain, American troops occupied Cuba. It took 3 years until U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt allowed elections to create a Cuban government. The only candidate for the new office of President of Cuba was Tomás Estrada Palma. It was up to him to bring democracy to the island, as Cuba had never had an elected government before.
La evaluación de él como presidente, en líneas generales, no es una evaluación favorable. Su gobierno se inicia el 20 de mayo de 1902 y todavía en la población cubana, en las mentalidades, en el imaginario, o cuando se presagia algo negativo, en el imaginario popular, en el habla de los cubanos, se habla de que te va a caer encima un 20 de mayo.
Estrada Palma's negative image was born even before his election. He had lived most of his life in the United States and was seen as their candidate. The most promising other candidate withdrew his candidacy before the election in protest of America's perceived control over Cuba's affairs.
Estados Unidos, a través de una serie de movimientos políticos y diplomáticos, como fueron la resolución conjunta o la enmienda Platt impuesta a la Constitución cubana de 1901, por medio de la cual Cuba tenía que ceder territorios para la actual base naval de Guantánamo, pues Estados Unidos fue concretando su control sobre Cuba.
The so-called Platt Amendment was added to the Cuban Constitution under U.S. pressure. It guaranteed the United States the right to intervene in Cuba, should they think it necessary. It also allowed the United States to establish military bases in Cuba. One of these was established at Guantanamo Bay in 1903. As the biggest U.S. naval base outside of the United States, Guantanamo was paramount to controlling shipping in the Caribbean. However, together with the right to intervene on Cuba, it also meant that the newly independent island was not so independent after all.
Американский бизнес с самого начала так называемого освобождения Кубы от испанского господства чувствовал себя на Кубе абсолютно вольготно. Был же генерал-губернатор после победы над Испанией в испано-американской войне, который командовал всем имуществом Кубы.
Following its independence, Cuba's greatest treasure was its sugarcane. Cuba's climate and soils were perfect, and Cubans had perfected its cultivation for over a century. A good many Cubans made a living from sugar, from the poorest peasant cutting the cane with a machete to the sugar barons, whose factories transformed the raw cane juice into white gold. Sugar represented 80% of all Cuba's exports, with most of it going to the USA.
As part of the arrangement between Cuba and the United States established a quota, an amount of sugar that they would buy from Cuba. The price would fluctuate, but the amount of sugar would be arranged 1 million tons, 2 million tons a year, and Cuba would provide the sugar that the United States needed.
The sugar quota gave Cubans a sense of security going into the future, but it also made them neglect alternative crops. Almost all of Cuba's agriculture soon focused exclusively on sugarcane.
Nosotros endulzamos el mundo por muchos años, y el mundo nos agrió mucho a la vida por ese endulzamiento, porque nos convirtió en un país monocultor, dependiente de la economía europea primero y después de la economía norteamericana.
So sugar became a very important crop because the Cubans were able to plan the economy since they knew how much sugar they were going to sell, and the price of sugar was relatively good. They got significant amounts of money.
The United States needed more sugar than they could produce by themselves, a lot more. A year's worth of domestic sugarcane production wouldn't even last the United States a single month. Sugar was much more than a simple food item. The United States pharmaceutical and chemical industries also required large quantities. Cuba's War of Independence against Spain cost the lives of almost 500,000 men. This caused a tremendous labor shortage after the war. Cuba required hundreds of thousands of cane cutters to harvest the vast plantations twice a year. Working in the fields, a man could earn enough to make it through the year. It was an attractive prospect, and so Cuba became a mecca for migrants.
Sie hätten jeden genommen. Sie haben 120.000 Chinesen aus Kanton genommen, über 30, 40 Jahre lang, die quasi unter Sklavenbedingungen existiert haben. Sie hätten katholische Leute aus dem Schwarzwald genommen, gab es also Verhandlungen mit dem Deutschen Reich. Sie haben Leute aus den Azoren genommen, sie haben Leute von Madeira genommen, sie haben von überall her genommen.
Cuba's call for workers was heard back in its former motherland. Beginning in 1902, tens of thousands of unemployed Spaniards and other fortune seekers set off to try their luck in the Caribbean. They flocked to Spain's major ports, such as A Coruña, Cadiz, and Barcelona, from where they set sail for Cuba. For many of them, it wasn't their first voyage here. They had fought for Spain as occupying soldiers, only to now return as economic migrants. One of them was a peasant from Galicia. His name was Ángel Castro.
Ángel Castro fue un quinto español que había venido a Cuba a combatir por el ejército español. Estamos hablando de un quinto, son los jóvenes españoles que por un sistema de sorteo público y cada 5 en un listado, cada 5 nombres en ese sorteo vienen a la guerra de Cuba. Era un compromiso, un deber que él tenía con su país.
À la fin de la guerre, donc Ángel rentre en Espagne, il rentre chez lui en Galice, dans la région de Lugo, et doit retrouver sa bien-aimée. Il espère se marier avec elle. C'était sa fiancée, celle qui lui était promise. Mais la promise, eh bien, elle a rencontré quelqu'un d'autre. Et donc Ángel, meurtri, blessé, humilié, ne peut pas rester au pays. Donc il rentre à Cuba.
Ángel Castro settled in eastern Cuba, where he made a living as a day laborer. He worked in the cane fields and in the mines. He saved what he could and even won some money in the lottery. His dream was to be able to buy his own house. For him, like many others, Cuba was an opportunity to be free. But their freedom, as well as Cuba's, depended on the goodwill of the United States. This further provoked unrest in Cuba, especially in the capital, Havana.
Cuba became independent, but it had the amendment into its constitution allowing the United States to enter. And they didn't see the United States as an enemy or as a power that wanted to take over Cuba. They saw the United States as an ally of Cuba.
En realidad esas relaciones entre Cuba y Estados Unidos comenzaron a ser unas ciertas relaciones tensas bajo el control total de Estados Unidos.
October 6, 1906. Contemporary archive footage shows thousands of American soldiers invading Cuba without any warning. The island had no army and had to surrender without a fight. Cuba's elected government was dismissed. The United States acted perfectly legally. They made use of their right to intervene in Cuba, as guaranteed by the Platt Amendment. This amendment had been a hot-button issue when Cuba's constitution was written, and now this first invasion of Cuba seems to confirm the worries of many Cubans that their country was not truly free.
Officiellement, c'était pour une sorte de régulation de la vie politique cubaine, parce que bon, il arrive souvent dans pas mal de régions du monde, mais en tout cas aussi pas mal dans les Caraïbes, qu'un président, au départ régulièrement élu, fasse tous ses efforts pour continuer un nouveau mandat, si vous voulez.
Estamos hablando de que Cuba es la gran productora mundial de azúcar, o una de las grandes productoras mundiales de azúcar para ese instante, y esos intereses económicos deben ser cuidados.
The United States claimed that internal strife in Cuba was the reason for their invasion. There had, indeed, been riots since the last presidential election. People spoke of widespread electoral fraud, and Cuba's president, Estrada Palma, was under pressure. But without an army, he could not get the unrest under control and was forced to step down. The United States appointed a governor. He promised new elections, but until then, Cuba was once again in American hands.
The second American occupation had two consequences. One consequence is the belief that Cubans weren't really free, that they were very dependent on the United States, and that it wasn't a real independence for Cuba. And the second one is that the Americans that intervened in Cuba engaged in significant corruption and bribery and trying to pacify the Cubans through giving them jobs.
Together with the army, many new American investors arrived in Cuba. They wanted to benefit from the island's economic boom. The American military governor supported them. He granted them lucrative public contracts, including the outfitting of Cuba's newly founded armed forces. The railways, some ports, and much of the sugar industry were also brought under U.S. control. The Americans enrolled the Cuban elite, largely doctors and army officers of Spanish descent, and entrusted them with governing the island in their name. Many poor Cubans wondered what the War of Independence had ultimately given them.
Les Américains ont toujours eu un regard sur Cuba comme étant un peu un département américain. Donc les sociétés américaines s'y sont installées d'une manière très puissante, et en particulier dans cette région du nord-est de Santiago.
To succeed in Cuba, one had to be white and be able to make deals with the Americans. Spanish immigrant Ángel Castro saw his chance to do just that. He lived in Cuba's east, where most American companies were located. The biggest of them was United Fruit. The company preferred to work with Spanish migrants, like Ángel Castro.
Die Galizier arbeiten auf Teufel komm raus, die können alle Arbeiten machen, also sie sind wirklich extrem fleißige, oftmals sehr geizige, sehr sparsame Leute. Und das muss er ausgenutzt haben. Der hat eigentlich nichts anderes gehabt als ein Fuhrwerk und hat faktisch die Peripheriegeschäfte um die großen amerikanischen Firmen gemacht, vor allem United Fruit, und hat da einiges Geld verdient.
Ángel Castro, au fond, a joué pas mal le jeu des Américains. À un certain moment, il a été plus ou moins gérant, intendant d'un domaine américain. Donc à partir de là, si vous voulez, il a beaucoup appris parce que c'était un homme malin. Et il a appris, il a regardé, il a peut-être aussi fait des connaissances.
Ángel Castro's business with United Fruit flourished. The company had been founded in 1899 and had come to Cuba that very same year. In Cuba, United Fruit invested mainly in sugarcane. Elsewhere in the Caribbean and Central America, their main business was bananas.
They basically dominated the banana market, at least within the United States, more than 70% of the market share for most of their history. And in Central America and the Caribbean, they were often the main investor, particularly in small countries, and they were the main ones building infrastructure, such as railways, such as telegraph systems, such as even company towns around this production. And that is why many rulers in those countries, particularly authoritarian rulers, welcomed this firm in the beginning because it was providing something that they didn't have.
To portray itself in a positive light, United Fruit invested heavily in PR campaigns, such as the propaganda film, The Living Circle.
Also flowing northward in this living circle of trade are hardwoods, hides, cocoa beans, sugar, bananas, essential oils for making perfumes, and chicle, a necessary product for making chewing gum. The good earth of the tropics and the eager markets of the north are an unbeatable combination. A cup of coffee is as much a part of the American way of living as a daily newspaper, and a table without a sugar bowl is hard to find. Bananas are a favorite at breakfast and add flavor and nutrition to countless recipes.
What the film doesn't show is that far from only investing money, United Fruit amassed substantial political power in Central America and the Caribbean.
Cuba was about sugar. At the national level, United Fruit didn't have the power it had in Central America. However, at the local level, it was very different. There's this municipality called Banes that basically it had the local government in its pocket. And it became, not only kind of like the main political power, but even the main funding source for the government for many things. So Banes became kind of like the most important place of United Fruit in which the firm really showed its big power. And that is where Castro's family actually developed their business.
Working for United Fruit, Ángel Castro expanded his business. In 1910, his company already had 300 employees. Castro had risen from poor migrant to respected businessman. Through his contacts, he got to know the daughter of a United Fruit manager. Her name was Maria, and she was the village teacher. They were married on March 25, 1911.
Lui-même étant quasiment analphabète, il va apprendre à lire et écrire justement à son contact. C'est une femme un peu assez intellectuelle, qui joue du piano, etc., qui est vraiment dans un univers du grand propriétaire terrien qu'il est devenu. Il commence à lire les journaux, il devient un peu un personnage local qui a du poids, qui va dans les grandes soirées de la bonne société cubaine.
Cuba developed and grew alongside its American neighbor. In 1906, the year of the U.S. invasion, American investments reached $150 million, more than anywhere else outside the United States. American companies controlled Cuba's economy, and the American ambassador dictated policy to the Cuban government. Insurrection against America's dominance of Cuba was inevitable, and a new rebellion was on the horizon. The Platt Amendment, authorizing an American invasion at any time, hung like the sword of Damocles over the Cubans' heads.
Y esto lleva como una especie de herida que va a quedar en la sociedad cubana, al punto que en las próximas generaciones de cubanos, de la intelectualidad y también de los pensadores y del pueblo en su conjunto, se convirtió como en un elemento recurrente de protesta, como un elemento recurrente de crítica.
Cuba was the United States' #1 sugar supplier. The world market, however, was dominated by Russia and the German Empire, whose sugar came from sugar beets. But that changed in 1914, when the First World War broke out. Fighting wasn't limited to the trenches. Warships and blockades ravaged naval trade. The beet sugar trade collapsed. For Cuba, the elimination of its chief rivals was a unique opportunity. The island was in a position to become the new world market leader.
Demand was growing dramatically. In the first 20 years of the 20th century, the American demand for sugar was growing at a rate of 5% a year. So the potential was huge. And actually, they had this boom during World War I, but they had already been preparing for this growth of the American market.
During the war, the price of a pound of sugar rose from 3 to 22 cents. From American investors to the Spanish plantation managers and even the poorest Cuban peasants, the whole island profited from the war in Europe. But the success came at a price. Both forests and most coffee plantations were sacrificed to make room for more sugarcane. Cuba became a monoculture country.
Se dispara la producción azucarera, se dispara el precio del azúcar en el mercado mundial, llegó a estar a 22 centavos la libra, algo astronómico para la época, y es lo que se conoce en la historia de Cuba como las vacas gordas.
The exorbitant price of sugar encouraged worldwide competition. Java, the Philippines, India, Puerto Rico, Brazil, everyone wanted a share of the sugar market. The situation was exacerbated when World War I came to an end in 1918. Formerly closed trade routes reopened, and the world market was flooded with sugar. Prices slumped. And Cuba had to deal with the consequences of its sugar monoculture. The island had more sugar than it could ever hope to sell.
The problem with sugar is that the prices drop and rise. When the prices drop, the Cubans suffer.
Caen las acciones en el mercado de Nueva York, Cuba comienza una crisis, la banca cae en crisis, suicidio entre los grandes hombres de negocio, la sociedad cubana se desploma como entidad económica y caemos entonces en el periodo de las vacas flacas, que se conoce también en la historia de Cuba.
The principal victims of the crisis were Cuba's sugarcane cutters. Tens of thousands of them were the descendants of African slaves and now found themselves out of work and with no hope of getting any aid from the government.
Also wir haben immer eine große Gruppe von Arbeiterschaft, die faktisch gebildet wird aus ehemaligen Sklaven und Galiziern. Und die extrem ausgebeutet sind und die extrem in Lohnkämpfe verwickelt sind und extrem in Kämpfe um Arbeiterrechte verwickelt sind.
Many unemployed Cubans joined the island's army. It was the only job option available to them. But their conditions barely improved. They suffered under the leadership of the officers, who were almost universally white and of Spanish descent. The American companies that dominated Cuba's economy ensured that these Cubans had enough money to lead comfortable lives, despite the crisis. This ensured that American businessmen and their Cuban associates of Spanish descent could keep control of the island and its economy.
En realidad, en Cuba, burguesía nacional no existió. La burguesía nacional era muy débil, no miraba realmente hacia el país, miraba nada más que para Estados Unidos.
In the 1920s, Cuba was still dependent on the USA, but the contrary was no longer true. Since the end of World War I, the United States was able to buy their sugar elsewhere. America's biggest worry now was the growing threat of communism. With its armies of poor, unemployed workers, Cuba seemed like fertile terrain.
After the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet Union organized communist parties throughout the world, so the Cuban Communist Party was organized.
Unemployment was particularly high in Cuba's east, where Angel Castro lived. He had gone from occupying soldier and poor economic refugee to rich landowner. Don Angel's sugarcane cutters paid the price for his wealth.
Ce petit paysan galicien devient Don Angel. Il a énormément de main-d'œuvre haïtienne avec laquelle il se comporte plutôt à l'ancienne, c'est-à-dire très durement, c'est-à-dire qu'on n'est pas loin de l'esclavage. Donc on est quand même au Far West à cette époque-là. Il faut se souvenir quand même que Cuba à cette époque-là, c'est le Far West et les grands propriétaires terriens ont pratiquement droit de vie et de mort sur leurs employés.
Angel Castro had 5 children with his wife Maria. But by the 1920s, the couple had separated. Since 1922, Angel had an affair with his cook, Lina. In 1923, she gave birth to a baby girl, followed by 3 boys, Ramon, Fidel, and Raul. They did not yet bear the Castro name, and the family home was off limits to them. Instead, they grew up among the children of their father's poor employees.
C'est un énorme problème parce qu'à cette époque-là, évidemment, quand on est marié et qu'on fait un enfant à quelqu'un d'autre, eh bien, le divorce n'était pas tellement bien vu à cette époque-là et c'était même très compliqué d'un point de vue juridique pour divorcer. Donc il reste un temps avec sa femme légitime, mais il élève quand même, il fait élever Fidel Castro qui vit dans une forme de hutte quelque part à quelques centaines de mètres de la maison du maître, si je puis dire. Et donc Fidel Castro est élevé pendant des années en voyant son géniteur comme le propriétaire de cette terre qui lui échappe. Et donc pendant des années, il n'est pas reconnu par son père.
Uneheliches Kind war immer ein schwerer Makel. Und dadurch, dass Castro, ich meine, das erklärt vieles von der Psychologie von Fidel Castro, dass er eben lange Zeit uneheliches Kind gewesen ist und sein Vater erst mal verschiedene Notare bestechen musste, was üblich war, um dann eine richtige Geburtsurkunde zu kriegen.
The sugar crisis in Cuba began in 1918, with the end of the First World War. It would last many years. Many Cubans realized the astronomical pre-war prices were a thing of the past. Something had to happen. Cuba had to carve out a new path towards a future that didn't depend on sugar. In 1924, Cuba was gearing up for a presidential election. One man emerged as Cuba's potential savior, Gerardo Machado.
Machado was one of the military leaders on the side of the Cuban forces fighting for independence against Spain. After the independence, he emerged as a small political leader, not a very important one.
Es un hombre que se presenta como una solución a la crisis económica. Cuba es un país monoproductor, el azúcar lo es todo prácticamente para el país. Se establece un gran apotecma en el siglo XX cubano. Sin azúcar no hay país. Y esto da la medida de una crisis que en el año 21 comienza y se estabiliza, desgraciadamente, en el año 25. Hay temores. Se habla de que el azúcar ya no es el futuro de Cuba.
Gerardo Machado was a war hero who had fought for Cuba's independence. His campaign in 1924 was modern and well orchestrated, as this newsreel footage shows. He appeared as a general and openly flaunted his relations with the army. Machado promised to free Cuba from the domination of both sugar and the United States.
Él presenta un programa de gobierno que es una salvación, entre comillas, para la sociedad y el modelo azucarero.
Instead of relying almost solely on sugar, Machado wanted to invest heavily in Cuba's infrastructure. He promised water, roads, and schools. What's more, he also wanted to get the United States to renounce their right to intervene on Cuba. Elections were held on November 1st, 1924. Gerardo Machado emerged the clear winner.
Se convierte en presidente, trae un programa basado en varios puntos. Estoy recordando ahora una política de aranceles, un control del Estado de los precios del azúcar. Estoy hablando ahora también de restringir las zafras azucareras para controlar los precios en el mercado, un plan de obras públicas para absorber ese desempleo tan grande que había generado la producción azucarera.
Machado's first and most ambitious project was to build a highway across Cuba, connecting its distant provinces with the capital, Havana. With Cuba's national highway, Machado wanted to create an alternative to the railway, which was owned by U.S. companies. Afterwards, Machado had a new parliament building constructed, followed by many other famous buildings. Machado's construction boom was largely financed by American banks. Under his leadership, Cuba's economy recovered. The island became a model for Caribbean development. Cuba soon had the most modern telephone network in the Americas and more radio stations per capita than any other country. However, a new crisis loomed at the height of Machado's success. On October 24, 1929, the American Stock Exchange collapsed. It was the start of the Great Depression.
La crise de 29 frappe Cuba dès 1930. Donc dès cette période-là, Machado, qui est au pouvoir depuis 2 ans ou 3 ans, ou dans ces eaux-là, il se raidit parce qu'il voit bien que la contestation sociale enfle.
Und da fängt an, dann die Sache unter Kontrolle, versucht die Sache unter Kontrolle zu halten durch informelle Schlägertrupps von der Regierung und dann gleitet das sozusagen langsam in diese Diktatur ab.
In October of 1932, almost 3 years to the day after the beginning of the Great Depression, Cuba was struck by the worst hurricane in its history. President Machado personally oversaw the reconstruction efforts. He organized aid to hard-hit areas and tried to portray himself as Cuba's savior once more. But the people had lost confidence in their president.
Prend des mesures qui le rendent de plus en plus dictateur, si vous voulez. Il n'a pas été élu comme dictateur, il ne s'est pas emparé du pouvoir, mais progressivement, il a fait évoluer son pouvoir, disons, démocratique, jusqu'à un certain point, vers une dictature visant à brider le mouvement social cubain,
The The American banks that funded Machado's construction boom in the 20s now wanted their money back. Machado had to make budget cuts to pay his debts. He laid off thousands of civil servants who promptly took to the streets in protest. They were joined by thousands of other Cubans, fearing they too could lose their jobs. It was the beginning of yet another rebellion in Cuba. But unlike his predecessor in 1906, Machado had an army and a powerful police force, and no qualms about deploying them against unarmed protesters.
Well, the American reaction wasn't... The Americans didn't react. The Americans were concerned about events in Europe, Hitler, and what was happening in Europe, and they were more interested in stability in Cuba.
Machado's police force killed a student leader during a demonstration. His death lit a fuse. Havana's university students joined the demonstrators, followed by Cuba's intellectual elite. They accused Machado of being a dictator and his regime as tropical fascism.
One of those was Grau San Martin, who was a professor of medicine at the University of Havana. He was not actively in politics, but he supported his students who were very active against Machado. So as a result of that, when Machado's dictatorship fell apart and the Cuban regime fell apart, the students looked at Grau as their leader.
As a doctor, Grau treated poor patients for free. As a politician, he was also committed to defending the rights of the less fortunate. Grau was arrested several times for revolutionary activities. Under the pressure of Machado's regime, he finally fled Cuba and sought exile in Miami. But the riots in Havana continued unabated.
In one thing, the intellectuals are united, it's in their opposition to Machado. They felt that military regime shouldn't develop in Cuba. Machado was a colonel in the army. He has developing a military dictatorship.
The burgeoning insurrection in Havana went barely noticed in eastern Cuba. After 12 years of marriage, landowner Angel Castro wanted to divorce his wife, Maria. He'd been living with his cook, Lina, for many years. Their children were growing up between different worlds. Fidel and Raul lived between the wealth of their father and the poverty of the Afro-Cuban sugarcane cutters that worked for him. And they still bore their mother's name instead of Castro. This, at least, their father wanted to change.
Ce qu'il faut comprendre dans le lien qui unit Raúl Castro et Fidel Castro, c'est simplement le fait que ces deux frères n'ont pas eu de père pendant des années. Ils n'ont pas été reconnus en tant qu'enfants légitimes. Ils étaient donc un peu des bâtards ou des semi-orphelins.
Der Fidel Castro wird ja revolutionär, weil gegen seinen Vater zunächst rebelliert. Also gegen diese Meinung, vor allen Dingen gegen die extrem starke Hierarchisierung der Landbevölkerung, die bei ihm beschäftigt war. Ich meine, der Junge ist da rumgerast und hat mit denen zu tun gehabt, mit den Schnittern, mit den Haitianern und so weiter. Deshalb kann der auch so gut mit den Leuten. Und der Vater hat sie faktisch immer zum Arbeiten angestellt, hat ihn wenig bezahlt, hat sie schlecht behandelt.
In 1933, Angel Castro sent his rebellious son, Fidel Castro, to live with a teacher in Santiago, the biggest town in eastern Cuba. The elder Castro hopes that this will guarantee a better education for Fidel, who is only 6 years old.
La vie à Biran était une vie paysanne, hein, et une vie non seulement paysanne, mais une vie un peu rustre, quoi, si vous voulez. Alors évidemment, Angel a tenu à ce que ses fils fassent des études, ce qui est quand même important, mais lui-même était un homme qui ne percevait peut-être même pas nécessairement l'importance pour ses enfants de faire des études.
In the summer of 1933, demonstrations against Machado continue in the streets of Havana. They were supported by many Cubans in exile in Miami, such as Professor Ramon Grau. In order to quell the rebellion, President Machado declared martial law. The regime's opponents were arrested and tried in military courts. The minutes of many trials were taken by a non-commissioned officer called Fulgencio Batista.
Batista era de origen muy humilde. Era de los pocos ciudadanos en Cuba que descendían de los indios. Por eso el pueblo le decía el indio Batista.
L'histoire de Batista est aussi intéressante que l'histoire de Fidel Castro, si vous voulez. Donc Batista, qui se nommait lui-même fils du peuple, et c'était vrai d'ailleurs, donc originaire de l'Oriente, très près d'ailleurs de la ferme de Castro, des Castro, je veux dire.
As an NCO of color, Batista sympathized with the revolt against Machado. He was by no means the only soldier to do so. In August 1933, the first military men sided with the rebels. The generals panicked, fearing a revolt within the army. To avoid this, they urged President Machado to resign.
Die hohen patriotischen Offiziere haben gesagt, also wir können alle auch Präsident sein, es muss nicht Guerra oder Machado sein. Dadurch verliert er die Unterstützung der Armee.
President Machado fled to his last ally, the U.S. ambassador to Cuba. Machado knew that only a U.S. intervention could save him now. But instead of backing him, the U.S. ambassador, too, called for Machado to resign. Cuba's contested president saw only one way out.
Jeder Präsident, der irgendwie so schon nicht mehr ganz akzeptiert ist und nur seinen Regierungssitz sozusagen beherrscht und da bewacht wird, weiß natürlich, was auf dem Land los ist und dass ihm irgendwas blühen kann. Und da die Politik auf Kuba eben ist, wahre politische Überzeugung zeigt sich daran, dass es für mein Ideal sterben kann. Also es wird von ihm erwartet, dass er sterben soll. Wenn er das verteidigt und er das nicht möchte, dann haut er einfach ab.
Con la salida de Machado se piensa que el proceso revolucionario ha triunfado, pero después se dan cuenta la población, la intelectualidad, los pensadores, los que han participado como dirigentes en el proceso, de que la situación del país ha continuado igual.
With President Machado gone, the generals now ruled over Cuba, and the demonstrations continued. The military tried in vain to quell the uprising by handing out harsh prison sentences to its leaders. At these trials, military court stenographer Fulgencio Batista got to know many rebel leaders. Through them, he became familiar with the rhetoric and arguments of insurrection.
Der ist extrem gut vernetzt und dadurch hat er wahrscheinlich nicht viel Schwierigkeiten gehabt, die unterbezahlten, schlecht behandelten Soldaten und Unteroffiziere gegen die weißen Offiziere auszurichten.
On September 4th, 1933, Fulgencio Batista made a rousing speech to soldiers in his barracks, calling for rebellion. The non-white soldiers and NCOs arrested their white officers and generals. Batista declared himself Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces and became a key figure in Cuba's new power structure. Batista also called Ramon Grau back from exile in Miami and appointed him president.
Il a la finesse un tout petit peu d'actionner les manettes depuis le camp militaire de Colombia, qui est le grand camp militaire de la Havane, et donc c'est lui qui fait nommer les présidents.
Not all the officers surrendered peacefully. 400 of them took refuge in Havana's Hotel Nacional. They wanted to plead with the American ambassador for U.S. intervention to put down Batista's coup. U.S. President Roosevelt mobilized the army, but he did not want to attack. Seeing the Hotel Nacional crowded with his opponents, Batista sent 2,000 loyal soldiers to arrest them. The American ambassador fled both the hotel and the island. An American newsreel team was present when Batista's soldiers opened fire. The battle lasted 2 days until the officers within the hotel ran out of ammunition. With this victory, Batista eliminated almost all opposition in one stroke. Together with President Grau, he now wanted to lead Cuba into a brighter future.
The beginning of Grau ended the fighting, but began the real revolution, because Grau was young, was idealistic, and wanted a series of laws and regulations which he issued from the presidential palace, not through the constitutional means, no Congress, and so on. He was issuing decrees weakening the power of the United States.
Grau and Batista undertook a vast reform program. They wanted to turn Cuba into the most modern democracy in the world.
Die peitschen sozusagen in 100 Tagen zig Reformen durch, ja, Frauenwahlrecht und was weiß ich, Arbeitsgesetzgebung und alles Mögliche. 8-Stunden-Tag. Die peitschen alles durch. Das ist im Grunde, verträgt das kein bis dahin laufendes System, würde ich sagen, sogar heute noch, verträgt 100 Tage extreme Reformpolitik.
Giving workers greater rights lay at the heart of the reforms. This was a major concern for the American companies that dominated the Cuban economy. It also worried the U.S. government, afraid of seeing communism in Cuba.
Wenn es eine Revolution auf Kuba gegeben hat, die nicht erwartet gewesen ist und die Gefahr bringt, sozusagen Kommunismus an die Macht zu bringen, ist das diese Revolution gewesen. Es ist nicht die Castro-Revolution. Also die Massenrevolution auf Kuba hat 33 bis 35 stattgefunden. Die USA haben das überhaupt nicht auf dem Schirm gehabt, haben das überhaupt nicht gewollt.
When Batista ordered his soldiers to open fire against the Hotel Nacional, the United States did not intervene. But when President Grau introduced new labor laws, they sent their ambassador with an ultimatum to Batista.
В политике у лидеров, собственно, забота одна – как сохранить свою власть. Поэтому надо было, когда ему с левыми Батисте, он был в союзе с коммунистами. Когда в холодную войну было выгоднее быть союзником Соединенных Штатов, совершенно спокойно перекинулся на их сторону, получил их поддержку.
The United States was concerned about what's happening in Cuba, and they saw Batista as a stabilizing force, the guy that could control Cuban society. So Batista decided, with American support, to get rid of Grau.
Batista switched sides and sacrificed his revolutionary comrade, Grau. On January 15, 1934, Batista forced President Grau to resign after only 4 months in office. Batista annulled most of the reforms and installed a new president, and then another, and another. In Havana, as in Washington, no one had any doubts as to who was running the show in Cuba. Fulgencio Batista.
Batista emerged at that time as the de facto leader of Cuba. Not a popular leader, but the control of the military, and through the military, he controlled Cuba.
Batista's army upheld order in Cuba. The United States' fear of seeing communism in Cuba was allayed. And even for most Cubans, Batista's regime was preferable to the chaos of revolution that had preceded it.
Donc, à partir du moment où ces ministres communistes étaient très sérieusement sous la houlette d'un homme, Batista, qui, au fond, ne déplaisait pas aux États-Unis, qui n'a pas eu de grandes oppositions.
Y el premio fue que fue el dictador de Cuba, pero no directamente porque no era posible, sino que se puso a un señor mayor como presidente de la República, bajo el control de Estados Unidos.
Batista had the trust of the U.S. government. However, he also continued to work on the reforms he had once promised the Cuban people. One by one, Batista reintroduced these and many other reforms over the next few years, such as more rights for workers, women's suffrage, the 8-hour day.
Batista ist eigentlich ein extrem akzeptierter Mensch. Er zieht die Unterschichten hoch, die farbigen Unterschichten. Er macht Gesundheitsprogramme, er macht sogar Landreformprogramme. Also alles das, was Castro später in viel, viel größerem Umfang macht, ist eigentlich bei Batista schon angelegt.
But Batista's greatest achievement came in May 1934. By this time, he had only been Cuba's strongman for 7 months. He forged a new treaty with the United States and removed their right to intervene in Cuba from the island's constitution. Cuba was still under the thumb of its military leader, but for the first time in its history, it was a free and independent country. And so began the Batista era. It was not, nor would it be for years to come, the brutal and reactionary dictatorship that Cuba's next revolution would overthrow in 1959.